Hello everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Introductory Lecture Series. I am Professor Zaldivar, and today we'll be talking about John Stuart Mill and his theory, his ethical theory, utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill did not invent utilitarianism. It was actually invented by one of his mentors, Jeremy Bentham, but J.S. Mill is perhaps its best known or its most successful proponent. The basic theory behind utilitarianism is that actions are right in proportion to their tendency to promote happiness, and wrong in proportion to their tendency to promote the reverse of happiness. In other words, actions are morally right if they make us happy, and morally wrong if they make us unhappy. Now, he had a particular definition for what counts as happiness. Happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure. So, we can see from this that the basic theory behind utilitarianism is that an action is morally right if it promotes pleasure, if it increases the amount of pleasure in the world, or our pleasure. And an action is morally wrong if it decreases the amount of pleasure, or increases the amount of pain, which, according to utilitarianism, is basically the same thing. So again, morality is basically based on pleasure. Something is moral if it improves pleasure, and something is immoral if it lessens pleasure. Now, one problem with this is that people will sometimes argue that pleasure seems to be a rather crude thing to make the goal of all human action. In other words, it seems somehow inappropriate or crude or base to say that everything we should do should be in the pursuit of pleasure, especially bodily pleasure. The utilitarians have a response to this. The response comes in two steps. First of all, the idea that pleasure is crude is true only if you confuse human pleasure with bestial pleasure. In other words, if you think that the only pleasure available to humans is the same pleasure that's available to pigs, for example, then yes, utilitarianism would be crude, right? Because utilitarianism would at that point say that in order to be moral, you ought to do what is pleasurable for a pig. But that's not what utilitarianism says. The pleasures that are available to humans are not just those that are available to animals. We have uniquely human pleasures. In fact, the second part of the response is that truly human pleasure is more than just bodily pleasure, right? We have pleasures of the mind, emotional pleasures, intellectual pleasures. We enjoy things like poetry, plays, movies, the love of our families, pride, intellectual pursuits, all sorts of things. And not only do we like these things, which animals cannot like, because of course they don't have these sorts of higher level conceptual apparatus, for human beings, these uniquely non-physical pleasures are actually stronger and more pleasant than the physical pleasures, right? Most of us would prefer, not most of us, all humans prefer the pleasures of love and pride and accomplishment to the pleasure of a good meal, for example. We, of course, enjoy the pleasure of a good meal, but we'd rather accomplish something really fantastic and be adored by our friends or respected by our colleagues, etc., etc. A second problem that is sometimes used to argue against utilitarianism is that we can't decide, or how could we decide that one pleasure is greater than another? In other words, for utilitarianism to work, we have to rate our pleasures and work towards the best pleasures, the uniquely human pleasures. And amongst the uniquely human pleasures, there's a hierarchy of better and lesser pleasures. And for utilitarianism to work, to produce a moral society, everyone in there has to be dedicated to pursuing these great pleasures. But how can we decide which pleasure is greater than any other pleasure? Well, utilitarians have a response for this. Their first response comes in the form of an observation. You say, when we are wondering whether which pleasure is greater, we have pleasure A and pleasure B, and we're wondering which one is greater, we find people who are well acquainted with both pleasures, and we ask them which they prefer. And if these people are, if the well acquainted people, in other words, experts, always prefer one over the other, or almost always prefer one over the other, then the pleasure they prefer is unambiguously and unproblematically and uncontroversially better than the one they don't prefer. A second criterion we can have is we can ask people who are well acquainted with both pleasures if they would trade a small amount of one for a large amount of the other. So in other words, we might say, hey, would you trade a small amount of A for a large amount of B? And if the answer is no, then that's evidence that A is much more pleasurable than B, right? So if I asked you, would you trade one uh, well-made the pleasure of viewing one well-made movie for the pleasure of viewing 1,000 badly made movies? Most people would say, no, no, I'd rather watch one really good movie than 1,000 really bad movies, right? Or, you know, and so therefore one good movie is obviously better than 1,000 bad movies. Or if they say 1 pound of the best chocolate in the world versus 1,000 pounds of, I don't know, um, ramen noodles. And if people say, no, I'd rather have 1 pound of the best chocolate instead of 1,000 pounds of ramen noodles, that's clear that chocolate, or at least the best chocolate, is much better than ramen noodles, much more pleasurable. And some people will complain, well, um, there's something weird about going to experts and asking them what is more pleasurable. Don't I know what's more pleasurable? Can't I disagree with experts? And the utilitarians have two responses to this. One response is, um, there's really no criterion for deciding what counts as more pleasurable, except the feelings and judgments of those who have experienced both of them. So really, there's no way to judge whether chocolate is better than vanilla, except by going to people who've eaten both and asking them which one is better. And if there's a clear consensus that one is better, and that's pretty much the only evidence we've got that one is better. And if there isn't, then that's evidence that they're about the same, right? Um, there's no objective scale, right? We just go to experts, and that's just what we do, and that's normal. That's the only thing we can do. The second response utilitarians can offer is this. It may seem weird to say we should go to experts to consult pleasures, but we consult experts for everything, right? When you want to buy a car, what do? You read car magazines, you go to car websites, you go to Consumer Reports, you ask mechanics. In other words, you go to experts and ask them which car is best. And then that helps you decide which one you want. Same thing with movies. Same thing with restaurants. If you have an important date and you want to take your date to a really great restaurant to impress them, what do? Well, you call up your friends and you ask them, you call up your friends whose taste you trust, and you ask them, what's the best restaurant in town? And they'll tell you, and then you go to one of those restaurants, right? So rather than it being unusual to say we should go to consult experts and ask them what they find pleasurable, utilitarians can point out that in fact we do this all the time for just about everything, and so it's not really unusual at all. Furthermore, notice that this asking experts doesn't just give us a way of deciding which pleasures is better, whether pleasure A is better than pleasure B. It also gives us a way to figure out what's going to be pleasurable, right? So imagine that we have to decide whether some new experience is pleasurable or not, and we're not sure. It's something we've never had and we're not sure. It's some new fruit, for example, or new food that you've never tasted, or a new band that you've never heard and you're wondering whether to go to their concert. And what do here? You go and ask experts, and the experts will tell you, yes, that's really good. you should go and have that experience. So in other words, um, when we're determining whether or not to engage in certain behaviors or whether or not certain behaviors are going to be pleasurable, we also turn to experts. So we don't turn to them just when we're comparing known pleasures. We turn to them when we're trying to decide whether particular things are going to be pleasurable or not. So those are the two main objections, but there's some further thoughts. Those are the responses to the two main objections, but there's some further thoughts that we can consider when thinking about utilitarianism. First, ask yourself, would a human ever give up higher abilities, their higher abilities, even if it meant a life full of happiness as a lesser animal? In other words, if someone came to you and said, hey, I'm going to remove your ability, I'm going to turn you into a pig, and I'm going to remove your ability to feel love and pride and satisfaction at a job well done and human joy and appreciation for movies and literature and sports, etc., etc. And I'm going to turn you into a pig, and so you're basically just be able to enjoy eating and nothing else. And is that a deal you would make? You'd be guaranteed to be a happy pig, right? But you wouldn't be able to enjoy any of the things that humans enjoy, or that are uniquely human pleasures. And the utilitarians argue, and I suspect that they're right in this, is that no person who truly understands the value of human pleasures, who's truly experienced all the full range of human pleasures, would ever give those up for the pleasures of a lesser animal. Another thought is that it is true that men sometimes seem to make wrong choices. They sometimes seem to pick less pleasurable things, right? Or they go against the advice of experts, etc. However, this is not because they deliberately prefer the lesser pleasure. If they did deliberately prefer the lesser pleasure, that would be a counter-argument against utilitarianism. But utilitarians argue that there are mechanisms which account for picking a lesser pleasure, like weakness of will, or feeling you have no options, or not really understanding what's at stake. For example, they don't really understand the greater pleasure and they think it's not a pleasure at all or something like this. In other words, when we know what is at stake, or when we have an accurate evaluation of all of the pleasures at hand, we will always pick the most pleasurable one, the uniquely human pleasure. Finally, there are a couple of caveats of restrictions to keep in mind when we're thinking about utilitarianism. The happiness of many is preferable to the happiness of few. In other words, you're not allowed to make yourself happy at the cost of someone else's happiness. You're not allowed to make a small number of people happy at the cost of a large number of people. In fact, you're not even allowed to make a large number of people happy at the cost of to a small number of people if that cost can be avoided. So you can't go around and sit there and say utilitarianism argues for slavery because if we can enslave 20% of the population, the rest of us would have much better lives. Utilitarianism doesn't do that. It says everyone ought to be happy, and a good utilitarian will choose those actions which make the greatest number of people happy. And finally, you must be absolutely impartial when weighing your happiness against someone else's. In other words, your happiness doesn't count for more. If there are several actions available, you can't pick the ones that make you happy and make someone else unhappy. You ought to pick the ones that make you both happy. Or if there are two actions, one in which you're a little bit happy and the other person is unhappy, and another option in which you're unhappy but the other person is very, very, very happy, then you should pick that second option because it leads to more happiness overall than the first option. So basically, John Stuart Mill argues that we ought to try to pursue pleasure, we ought to try to be happy, and as long as we're trying to make as many people happy as possible, and as long as we recognize that everyone is entitled to be happy, and everyone's happiness is equally important, then pursuing happiness and pursuing pleasure will create a moral and good society. That is all for now. As always, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Um, and don't forget to turn in your work on Friday. Have a good week.